I feel that everything was rushed for the teachers, for the students, for all staff involved in our educational system.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
I was just going to cut you off, Jody, because the Prime Minister's speaking. I hope you don't mind. He's popped out. My best to you and to your family and to your son. Take care of yourselves. Thanks for speaking with us. And now let's listen to the Prime Minister of Canada.
For going above and beyond, not just these days, but every day. I'd
like to begin this morning by saying that this is the National Nursing Week. Nurses are at the very heart of our healthcare system. Every day they are doing an outstanding job to keep us all healthy. And the way they support people during this pandemic reflects their compassion, their resilience, and their dedication. To all the nurses out there, thank you for everything you're doing, not just these days, but every single day.
Since the beginning, our response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been driven by three fundamental objectives. The first is to keep Canadians safe and ensure we take every possible step to protect our most vulnerable citizens. This work continues daily, guided by our best doctors and medical experts, and it drives every move we make. The second is to protect individuals, workers, and families from the worst financial impacts of this pandemic, so you can put food on the table and cover your bills while staying safe. We're doing that with programs such as the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, the increase in the Canada Child Benefit this month, and the enhanced GST tax credit, among other measures. And thirdly, we are helping Canadian businesses through this extraordinary time, including for-profit, not-for-profit, and charitable enterprises, to ensure that workers across Canada can keep their jobs, so we can come roaring back after this difficult time is behind us. Aujourd'hui,
today, I am announcing the next phase of our support measures for businesses which collectively employ millions of Canadians and who have suffered unprecedented losses because of the pandemic. We will be extending the business credit program that was initially created so that small businesses can remain financially sound by including mid-sized businesses that need more capital. Export Development Canada and the Business Development Canada will be working with private sector lenders to increase access to capital by many tens of millions of dollars for Canadian companies in all industry sectors and all regions of the country. We will also be introducing the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility to help large companies that cannot receive funding through other means to get through this crisis. But I want to be clear, this is bridge financing, not a blank check. We are providing support to these large employers in order to protect millions of jobs right across the country. Our approach is based on a number of fundamental principles. First, we want to avoid seeing businesses go under. The goal of the business credit program is not to fund non-viable businesses or allow them to restructure. It is not our intention either to provide low-interest loans to large companies that don't need them. Second, we want to be fair. This funding will be accessible to all sectors and to all provinces and territories. And third, we will protect people's jobs. That is the most important thing. Businesses that receive this assistance will have to make certain commitments and keep them. For example, maintain jobs and investments, abide by collective agreements and their obligations with respect to pensions, and make specific commitments with respect to the environment. More specifically, there will be strict limits on dividends, share buybacks, and executive pay. In order to counter tax evasion and tax avoidance, businesses will have to disclose their financial structure when they apply for this funding.
Today, I am announcing the next phase of our support for enterprises that collectively employ millions of Canadians and are experiencing unprecedented losses due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We are expanding the Business Credit Availability Program, put in place to keep small businesses solvent, to mid-sized companies with a greater need for capital. Export Development Canada and the Business Development Bank of Canada will work with private sector lenders to free up access to capital in the tens of millions for Canadian companies in every industry and in all regions across Canada. At the same time, we are establishing a large employer emergency financing facility to provide bridge financing for our largest employers if they are unable to obtain financing through other means. But let me be clear, these are bridge loans, not bailouts. Just as we are finding ways to support small and medium-sized businesses, we'll provide loans to the largest enterprises to help them weather the storm and protect the millions of jobs they provide across Canada. In providing this support, we will be guided by several basic principles. The first is to avoid bankruptcies. Our purpose is to keep large Canadian companies on their feet and protect the millions of jobs they provide. The goal here is not to fix pre-existing insolvencies or restructurings, nor is it to provide low-cost lending to companies that don't need it. Second, we will be fair. Financing will be accessible to every industry sector in a way that is consistent in every province and territory right across Canada. And critically, we will protect workers and hold companies accountable. This is fundamental. Any company that receives this support will be expected to make and keep certain commitments. Those include maintaining jobs and investment, respecting collective agreements and pension obligations, and environmental and climate commitments. In particular, there will be strict limits on dividends, share buybacks, and executive compensation. To stand strong against tax avoidance and tax evasion, we will require companies to share with us their complete financial structure as they apply for funding. With this program, we're taking a bold step. Ideally, private sector lenders are adequate for the needs of large businesses. But in an extraordinary situation when that isn't always enough, we must act to prevent massive harm to Canadian workers and families and the Canadian economy. We will not allow millions of people to lose their livelihoods because of unprecedented events beyond their control. Finally, as we continue to work on plans to reopen, I want to say this. Please let caution and medical advice be your guides. We are all anxious to see life go back to something that looks more like normal. But we're not out of the woods yet, and we cannot squander the sacrifices we've made over the past 2 months. So when in doubt, if you can, stay home. Avoid gatherings. Wash your hands frequently and thoroughly, and maintain 2 meters distance from everyone else. This is how we will keep fellow Canadians who can't stay home and those working on the front lines safe. I'm now happy to take your questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre. On va commencer la période de questions par le téléphone aujourd'hui. Opérateur, c'est à vous.
Thank you. Merci. First question, Kate Bolongaro from Bloomberg. Line open.
Hi, Prime Minister. I have a question regarding LEAF. Companies will have to publish how their business ties into the government's sustainability objectives. And I'm wondering, will oil and gas companies be able to fulfill this requirement given the sector's contribution to Canada's CO2 emissions?
We have seen many oil and gas companies make commitments already around net zero by 2050, around understanding that we need to do better in terms of reducing emissions both as a country and as a sector. That's why we're expecting them to put forward a frame within which they will demonstrate their commitments to reducing emissions and fighting climate change. Okay. nous attendons à ce que tout le monde fasse
We
sa part
expect
pour contrer les
everyone to do
changements
their
climatiques.
share
Et
to
on a
counter
déjà
climate
vu
change,
plusieurs
and we've
grandes
already
compagnies
seen a number of
du
large
secteur
companies
pétrolier
in the
afficher
oil
des plans
sector
pour atteindre
present
le
plans
net zéro en 2050
to
et pour
achieve net
contrer
zero
les
by
changements
2050
climatiques en
and
réduisant leurs
fight
émissions.
climate change by
Nous
lowering their
attendons
emissions.
que
And
toute
we expect
compagnie
any
qui
company
accède à ce
that
financement
accesses this
va
funding
démontrer leur plan
to
pour faire partie de la
demonstrate that they're
solution.
going to do that and be part of the solution.
And another key part of these conditions are limitations on executive pay. But what mechanisms are you concretely and pragmatically going to put in place to ensure the appropriate level of executive pay that comes out of this fund, and what is the right amount in your opinion?
We will be sharing the details to come, but the principle is very clear. If a company wants to access this public financing, this taxpayer-funded financing for large employers in order to protect employees across the country, the money has to go to support those employers and not high-paid executives. That's a condition that they will have to abide by if they want to access this financing. Okay. Nous nous attendons à ce que
We
l'aide
expect
donnée par les
the assistance provided by taxpayers to these large companies to be there to help workers, not senior executives. So we expect any company that wants to access this financing and this assistance to make clear commitments, not to give more money to executives.
Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Raymond Filion, TVA. À vous.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Premier ministre.
Good morning, Prime Minister. I'd like to come back to what you said about Saturday, where you said you were quite concerned about citizens in Montreal with respect to the easing of the lockdown. Can you tell us exactly what you're concerned about? Well, I think there is every reason to be concerned right across the country. People are worried about their parents and grandparents who are in long-term care homes. As Prime Minister, I'm concerned about the whole country, and that's why we're taking unprecedented measures to protect Canadians and invest in the economy. As a Quebecer and as the MP for Papineau in Montreal, I am obviously feeling a responsibility and a concern for other citizens. And I'm not only concerned, but I want to work collaboratively with the different levels of government, and we are working very well with the Legault government to ensure that we will be able to protect Quebecers and all Canadians in this pandemic.
I think as we all are, there are things to be concerned about these days. Canadians across the country are worried for their families, for their loved ones, for their communities. As Prime Minister, I'm worried about people across the country. As Member of Parliament for Papineau and a Quebecer, I'm also worried about my fellow Quebecers and the citizens in my riding. That's why it is so important that we continue to work with the Quebec government on our shared goal of ensuring that people get through this as best we possibly can, and we will continue to work hand in hand with the Quebec government on exactly that.
En suivi, Ray.
Follow up.
Ma question portait spécifiquement sur le
My question had to do with easing the lockdown. As a national leader, are you 100% comfortable with what is happening in Quebec? For example, the reopening of schools starting today. Well, I think it's very important to follow the principles that we set out and ensure that at every step we have enough protection in place and an ability to respond if there is a resurgence of COVID-19. So, of course, I fully respect Quebec in terms of its choices, and we will be working with them to ensure that whatever decisions they make on reopening will be as safe as possible by providing more PPE and ensuring there's a sufficient testing ability, and we'll be there as a partner if they need us.
I think as we move forward, the role of the federal government will be to support provinces in their reopening plans. We will be there to help them make sure that there are enough testing for their levels, that there is more PPE arriving, that we're putting in place measures to follow the guidelines agreed to by all provinces and the federal government on necessary prerequisites to opening.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Althea Raj, Huffington Post. Lionel?
Good morning, Prime Minister. Thanks. Do you believe the provinces and territories are currently testing enough people for COVID-19?
I think we need to do more testing right across the country. Last week, we hit our 1 millionth test for Canadians, but there's a lot more to do. We know that as the economy starts to reopen, it's going to be more important to ensure that we have strong testing protocols right across the country. We need to increase the numbers. We've managed to support the provinces on obtaining reagents, on obtaining equipment for it. We need to see more lab capacity opening up, which many provinces have already done in turning to universities and private labs. There's lots more to do on testing, and we need to make sure we're working on that all together. Okay. Je pense que c'est nécessaire de faire encore plus de tests de dépistage.
Really necessary to do more testing. We carried out our 1 millionth test last week, but we need to do more. This is a critical part of reopening the economy. So as a federal government, we will be there to support the provinces and territories so that they can carry out even more testing. And I think that's absolutely essential for the future steps to succeed.
Thank you. So as we begin to reopen the economy and ease restrictions, should testing be available to all who want it?
I think as we've seen throughout this situation, there are very different factors and different situations on the ground across the country. The situation in Prince Edward Island is very different than the situation in British Columbia, which is different from Nunavut and different from Ontario or Quebec. Obviously, every jurisdiction needs to make determinations about what the right and maximal level of testing is that they need, but we will be there as a federal government to encourage them to do as much as they possibly can and make sure that we're helping them access the material needed to do just that.
Thank you. Operator, la dernière question.
Merci, thank you. De Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir, à vous.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau. Aujourd'hui, au Québec,
today in Quebec, primary schools and daycares are opening up. The government believes that the work environment is safe for them, but there are teachers and educators who are refusing to go back to work. Do you think that those individuals should be able to receive the CERB? Well, that's a very important question, and I think we do have to ensure that in Canada, all across the country, people are able to work safely when they go back. That's what we are working on now with the province of Quebec to ensure that they have not only the necessary rules in place that they will establish, but also that they can reassure people. I know that people are concerned right across the country as we start to ease the lockdown, and I think it's very important for employers to be able to reassure their workers that they can work safely. Follow-up. Yes, but Mr. Trudeau, with all due respect, you're not really answering the question. There are more and more provincial premiers who are concerned about the effect of the CERB on people's desire to go back to work. Brian Pallister and Mr. Legault have said things of that nature. Can you guarantee the provinces that Ottawa will not provide the CERB to workers who could go back to work, but who are refusing to do so? The CERB is there to support people who cannot work because of COVID-19. And the priority right now is to protect people, to protect their families. The CERB exists in order to support those individuals. And it is the responsibility of the provinces to ensure that their return to work is safe. We will be there to help them. But the important thing in this circumstance is to ensure that families have the necessary support and that people are safe.
I think it's extremely important to remember that we are still very much in an emergency phase right now, where most of the economy is being in extreme slowdown right now because we have to make sure we're preventing the spread of COVID-19. The Canada Emergency Response Benefit is there to ensure that people can stay safe and support their families at the same time. As people look at going back to work, it will be the responsibility of the employers to demonstrate that situations are safe for people to return to work. The role of the federal government is to support the provinces and other employers in that work, but it's also our role to make sure that families and people are supported to be able to stay safe during this pandemic.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Parry with CBC. In your opening address, you talked about this new loan program. You talked about tax avoidance and tax evasion. I get that you don't want to give a loan to a company that's breaking the law to evade taxes, but on tax avoidance, what if you open up the books of a company applying for a loan, you find out they've been doing everything they can to pay as little tax as possible? Do they get a loan?
I think Canadians expect companies that get support from public dollars to have been responsible around paying their fair share of taxes. And certainly if we see situations where someone is engaged in aggressive tax avoidance, we will be putting in conditions or working out a way with them to ensure that they pay their fair share of taxes. Okay.
I think everyone expects large companies to pay their fair share of taxes. And if, looking at the details of their financial statements, we see that they haven't paid their fair share of tax to Canada, we will demand that they make changes in order to receive that public funding.
In your opening address that a lot of oil and gas companies have signed on to net zero commitments. So with the climate requirements in this new loan package, are you trying to freeze out companies that have not made those kinds of commitments?
On the contrary, I think people around the world in financial markets have seen that managing risk is extremely important. We're seeing it with COVID-19, and before we invest in a company, I think it's appropriate to look at what their risk mitigation strategies are. People will be asking about what their risk mitigation strategies for pandemics are as they invest in companies going forward. But we also know that climate change represents a significant risk to companies' bottom line as well. So it is perfectly natural for an investor, including public investors like the Government of Canada, to be asking people how they are going to manage the risk of climate change in the coming years.
Brian Mullen, Global News. On today's announcement, strict limits on bonuses and share buybacks is not the same as stopping them. What specific safeguards will be in place to ensure companies don't take advantage?
We will be working very closely with different companies across different sectors to determine the right frame that is right for their industry and business. But Canadians expect that if we're putting public dollars to support financing for companies, that the money goes to support workers. That is the approach with the large employers emergency financing facility. We need to support workers, and that's not shareholders through dividends, that's not executive bonuses, that is ensuring that everything they're doing is protecting workers, their pensions, their collective bargaining, and the continued operation of this company in the country.
If there aren't safeguards in place, will you consider putting some in place?
I think that is part and parcel of the discussions that we'll have before implementing the LEAF program. We need to make sure that the money is going to support workers every step of the way.
We have to ensure that the money we're giving to these large corporations will be helping employees, not the executives, not investors, but the workers. And we will be introducing measures to ensure that we are there to support workers, their pensions, respect for their collective agreements, and all those aspects, because those companies employ millions of Canadians, and they will have to abide by those rules to access this funding.
From CTV National News. How much is the government willing to spend on these checks to these major companies? And is the government taking on too much risk in this time of a pandemic when we don't know how long it's going to go on for?
I think the significant risk is that we see long-term damage to the Canadian economy, that we see significant large companies that employ millions of Canadians lose their existence, stop functioning because of this pandemic, and millions of Canadians lose their jobs. We need to make sure that we are supporting these employers so that Canadians can continue to have jobs once we bounce back from this pandemic. pandemic. Of course, we would much prefer that people look onto the private credit markets to get the loans and bridge financing they need, but we will be there as a lender of last resort to ensure that those companies do continue to employ the Canadians across the country who depend on those jobs, but there will be significant conditions around that as well. Okay.
Our priority in this situation is always to ensure that we're there to support workers who are working in many different businesses right across the country. So the important thing is to prevent these companies from failing, which would cause serious damage to the Canadian economy. Of course, we would prefer that these companies find private financing, but if they cannot find it because of the pandemic, we will be there to support them during these difficult times.
Over the weekend, South Korea saw an outbreak related to a nightclub there. Obviously, we are still don't have nightclubs open here, but it does show how quickly outbreaks can happen, and they've decided to postpone opening schools. Today, schools outside of Montreal are now opening in Quebec. Are you willing to put any pressure on premiers across the country to tell them to slow down right now, given how you've said we're still in an emergency phase?
I think we're all feeling pressure from Canadians to get this right. And we understand that the sacrifices we've all made for the past 2 months of staying home, of self-isolating, of keeping 2 meters distance, of not seeing parents and grandparents, could all go up in smoke if we move too quickly on reopening, or if a given jurisdiction makes the wrong decisions. That's why being cautious and gradual and vigilant is essential for how we move forward on the gradual reopening. And that's why Canadians across the country are looking very carefully at all orders of government and the decisions they make, and will be held to account if reopening happens too quickly and Canadians have to lock down once again in a few weeks because people were overeager to get the economy going. We have to get that balance right, and that means being cautious, and we will continue to be pushing for caution as we move progressively towards reopening the economy.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau, Christian Noël de Radio-Canada. Aujourd'hui, l'aide que vous annoncez, c'est sous forme de prêts et de garanties.
You are offering is loans and guaranteed loans. Now, is this the final measure that will be there for large companies? And how long can a government support an economy so considerably? For how long can that happen? Well, we're in a very difficult situation now. And we just don't have any previous experience to rely on. So we know exactly how things will work. So we have to make the best decisions possible. And as we've been doing from the outset, we've been announcing new programs. And if there's a need to extend them or shorten them or adjust them, we will do that. At every step of the way, we are guided by 2 principles. First of all, keeping Canadians healthy and safe. Second, allowing the Canadian economy to bounce back and fire up again in the coming days. But of course, we have to take our time and adjust as things evolve. And this is a major announcement we're making today to support large employers. And we may have other announcements to make at further steps along the way, but all the time we're trying to maximize the impact of the measures that we've already announced so that we can begin to start up the economy again, and so that the government can do less and less as we move forward.
I think throughout this pandemic, we have been guided by 2 strong principles. One is protect the health and safety of Canadians. And second in order of importance, is ensure that our economy is able to bounce back quickly and strongly once all this is over. That means doing things strongly right now to support people, but also make sure that there is an economy to come back to once we do start reopening and life starts to get back to normal. So what we've announced today with the large employer emergency financing facility, the LEAF, will be a significant help to significant employers right across the country. There may be more steps we have to take. We don't know what the next possible steps are that we're going to need. We're going to stay open and flexible to adjusting the programs we put forward, to stretching them out, to condensing them, to combining them. We've demonstrated every step of the way that we're figuring out what works best, and if something doesn't work great, we'll pull it back and tweak it and try and put it out in a different way. We're in an unprecedented situation, but every step of the way, we will do what is necessary to protect Canadians and to ensure that we have an economy to go back to.
J'essaie de comprendre un peu où vous êtes rendu dans votre projection d'aide.
Where you are in terms of your projections of the kind of assistance that will be needed. You have announced billions of dollars that has been given to companies, but today these are loan guarantees that will have to be paid back. Is this because you think that we're coming to the end of our ability to bring out billions of dollars every other day? No, this announcement is part of a gradual series of measures which are there to help companies and employees that have lost their job. We wanted to put money directly into people's pockets. Now, for small businesses, we provided loans under very positive conditions that cost practically nothing to help them out. Now, mid-sized companies, they require a bit more in terms of the size of those loans, and for large companies, that funding will cost even more because they have access to a level of credit that workers and individuals and small businesses do not. So we're providing loans to these large companies because our priority is to help as many individuals and workers as possible in this country. And we expect the large companies to be able to get along as much as possible through the financial markets they already have access to.
Merci tout le monde.
All right, that is the